Okay, ladies, we're back. This one will be a lot shorter, I promise. So, as I said before, we're going to talk about the Great Revolt of 1857 or the Sepoy Rebellion, depending on your point of view. So, what led to this Great Revolt of 1857? So, we've got the British East India Company in charge, large and in charge in India, or certain parts of India anyway. Um, so, what leads them rebelling against their leadership? Well, there was a lot of discontent that led up to this. So it wasn't just one event. There was a great deal of discontent that led up to this. The British outlawed some Hindu practices, such as ritual suicide, which infuriated a lot of Hindus. They disliked having people telling them what to do. Some of the leaders did. They didn't appreciate that very much. There was a great deal of anger over high taxes. Um, they resented the missionaries that had made efforts to try to convert them to Christianity, although they did convert some people to Christianity. And so there was a lot of discontent that was leading up to this. And then also, all the Indian people had been basically removed from any positions of power, any lower positions, government positions, nothing. They had all been replaced with British people of the British East India Company. So, then we go to the treatment of the sepoys. Now, the sepoys were the Indian soldiers in the army, and this was an army of the British East India Company. It had some support from the British army, the government's army, but they had their own army, their own courts, etc., etc. This is still the British East Indian Company in charge. So the sepoys were relegated to the lower ranks. There was a definite hierarchy. The British got all the high positions, and the sepoys got the lower positions. At first, there was an effort to be sensitive to their religious beliefs, but that was soon overshadowed by a great deal of discrimination and racist treatment. So, the straw that breaks the camel's back here, that starts this, are some rifles. There was a rumor that the gun cartridges that you had to use, and there's going to be a diagram of this on the next slide, the gun cartridges that the soldiers had to use were greased with pork and beef fat. And you had to bite the cartridge. You actually had to bite the cartridge and then pour the powder into the gun to load it. So Muslims don't eat pork, Hindus don't eat beef. Some of the sepoys refused to use the Lee Enfield rifles. And on May 10th, 1857, a group of sepoys who had refused to use the rifles were publicly humiliated, expelled from service from the army, and imprisoned. That's the spark that starts the Great Revolt of 1857. It spread very quickly. There's a great map on page 12. We've got a map here that has in orange there the area of the Sepoy Revolt. I think it's even a little bit bigger than that, but there's a map on page 12 of that reading I gave you that shows you. It spreads very quickly. 130,000 soldiers rose up, and then many civilians joined them. The rebels had a variety of reasons for fighting. However, not all of the sepoys fought. In Bengal and Punjab, some of them fought actually with the British or didn't fight at all. So this was an extremely violent war, an extremely violent rebellion. Atrocities were committed on both sides. For the Indian, one example is the Kanpur massacre. This was a military base, and after killing all of the soldiers, 200 women and children were also murdered, and some of them thrown down a well to try to hide them. And they had promised not to harm the women and children. And so this atrocity was used by the British to stir up people, both back in Great Britain and in India, their troops as well. The Brits, for their part, had held public executions, burnt entire villages. Tens of thousands of sepoys and civilians were killed in the process of them trying to retake. Now, to regain control, it took them quite some time. They regained Delhi, which was kind of considered to be the center of the rebellion, in September 1857. However, they didn't gain control of all of the areas that had rebelled until the spring of 1859. So a lot of Indians call this the First War for Independence. And of course, the British point of view at that point in history was very different. It was the Sepoy Mutiny, and all the London papers carried all the atrocities that were committed by these savages. Of course, it didn't do much with what led up to the rebellion and why it happened. Okay, so the big result of this is, first of all, you get a lack of trust between the Sepoys and their British leaders. So never again, there had been some relationships there where the British and the Sepoy soldiers were friendly with each other, at least had respect for each other. That there's a lot more distrust after that in the army, and really one of the big things that, oh, here's the guns. Here we go. So here you go. Here's the cartridge, the greased cartridge, and here's the paper case, and the powder, and you had to bite the end of it off and then pour it in your gun there and stamp it down, and then you could shoot if somebody didn't shoot you before you did all that. So that's what you had to do. Okay, so the other big result that comes out of the Great Revolt of 1857 is that the company, the British East India Company, is completely abolished at that point in time, and the British Crown takes over. Here's Queen Victoria over here. Okay, so the British Crown takes over, and India becomes a British colony. India is often called the crown jewel of the British Empire. It's one of its most profitable colonies. You'll remember that the opium that was shipped to China oftentimes came from the poppy seeds that were grown in India. So it never made it back to Great Britain, but it becomes it makes Great Britain very wealthy. So she promised, Queen Victoria, when these people became her subjects, she promised that all of her subjects in India would be treated equally. However, that did not happen. That promise turned out to be empty. And the crown quickly took steps to make sure they could put down any rebellion again, including building extensive railway lines so that they could get rush troops to any part of India. Excuse me. Any part of India at any time to put down a revolt. A colonial economy, which should sound a little bit familiar to you, was set up, and Indians were encouraged to grow cash crops. This hurt local industry. Unlike Africa, India already had very, very strong local industry, artisans that supported their own economy under the Mughal Empire. So this hurt local industry quite a bit when they did this. The higher caste, and the British did adhere to the caste system, the higher caste Indians were offered education, and there were colleges built in India, actually, in this case, although some people, like Mohandas Gandhi, went to Europe to be educated. And like the education in Africa, it was very Eurocentric, English-based, European history, the greatness of the British Empire, etc., etc. But a middle class did emerge, and again, like in Africa, they learned about such ideas as freedom and liberty and wondered why they weren't allowed such things. And because of this education, Indian nationalist groups began to form that began to see India as a nation that deserved its independence. The first group that formed and would remain a major group through independence and still a political party today was the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885. Here's a picture of the first gathering of the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress, an initial goal was to call for reform, for changes, to give Indians more self-rule, but not necessarily called for independence at first. Now, the Indian National Congress was always open to Muslims and Hindus. However, there were some Hindus in the Indian National Congress who called for Hindu nationalism rather than Indian nationalism. Not all of them, but there were some. So the Muslims and many of them who were in the Indian National Congress began to be very mistrusting of that attitude of a thought of Hindu nationalism rather than Indian nationalism. And they formed their own nationalist organization called the Muslim League. The tension and distrust, unfortunately, over the years would grow between these two organizations. Both of them are going to have a huge impact on India's road towards independence, and unfortunately going to lead to some of the partition that takes place between India and Pakistan in the end. So that's it for this chapter. And the next chapter will go on to the Indian independence movement and Gandhi and Nehru and all of these people, Jinnah, that had a huge role in independence for India. But for now, we're going to stop there with Indian nationalist groups just growing. The Sepoy Rebellion, or the Great Revolt of 1857, being a huge turning point for India, where it becomes a colony rather than under the control of the British East India Company, and set up a colonial economy, etc., etc. Okay, that's it. I told you that was going to be shorter. All right. Have a nice weekend, ladies.